Okay, I think we can get started now. Hi everyone, my name is Chris Snyder, and I am the program coordinator with Recover Alaska, and I'll also be your host today while we start our inaugural advocacy training seminar. And let me share my screen with you now to bring up some introductory slides. Okay. So a little bit of background about our organization. We are Recover Alaska, and our goal is to reduce excessive alcohol use and related harms across the state. We do this by convening a statewide alcohol misuse prevention alliance, by working to increase access to care across the continuum, by shifting social norms around drinking and reducing stigma around alcohol use disorders, and by advocating for policy change, which is what we'll be discussing today. Now, one of the primary strategies in this work is policy change, to create a safer, healthier, and more equitable built environment. We analyze policy and work with legislators at the state and local level, as well as with other organizations and subject matter experts to craft and advocate for policy improvements. Doing this work, one thing we commonly hear is that organizations avoid advocacy work because they think they are not legally allowed to, or are afraid or unaware of the restrictions around lobbying. In these conversations with people, they've asked for us to perform a training to understand what is allowable, and this training is in part a response to this request. And then next, I'd like to just give notice to our partners that back Recover Alaska. We have many partners here, as you can see, and without them, none of this would be possible. They really do provide us a lot of good support to fulfill our mission. Now, a little bit of housekeeping and the agenda that we're going to go based on today. First, we will start off with Mike Walsh, who is the Vice President of Public Policy with Foraker Group, and he'll touch upon why advocacy is important and explaining the advocacy lobbying continuum. From there, next we'll go to Teri Tibbett from Alaska Mental Health Board Advisory Board on Alcoholism and Drug Abuse, and she will speak on the importance of the personal story in advocacy. And then lastly, we'll close with Tom Lucas, who is the Campaign Disclosure Coordinator with Alaska Public Offices Commission, often known as APOC. And he will touch upon the fine line between education and campaigning, and when to register and reporting requirements with APOC. Now, as you guys know, this is a 3-hour-long training, so quite a bit of time here. So what we'll have is that we'll have allotted time after each speaker to answer any questions that you may have. And I'll also defer to our speakers on their willingness to answer any impromptu questions that might arise during their segments. I'll help to facilitate these questions, and if folks can just put questions in the chat, or depending on the speaker's preferences, you know, just speak up. And lastly, we'll also have a 5 to 10 minute break after Mike Walsh's segment as time permits, as this is a long training again. But please feel free to come and go as you please while still being cognizant of any errant audio coming through your devices. And with that, I welcome Mike Walsh from the Foraker Group to begin our session.
Thanks, Chris. And we do have, there it is. Cool, thanks for bringing that up. We have a little bit of a PowerPoint to go through here. And is that my feedback, maybe? Can people hear feedback? I'm gonna switch phones here. Hold on a second. All right, that's better. I don't have feedback. Yay. So yeah, we'll go through this PowerPoint, and I'm, you know, super flexible. So if you've got a question you want to throw into the chat bar, I'll be monitoring that. I'll stop every once in a while to ask questions, or if you've got you know, a specific thing you want to cover, happy to do that. And if you want to go ahead and move that slide forward, Chris. So, a couple of things that we're going to talk about in my session is why we should even care about this. You know, Chris talked a little bit about why that's important. We're going to talk a little bit about the difference between lobbying and advocacy. Those are two words that often get confused, and so when Chris says that, you know, he hears nonprofits or others say they don't want to engage in advocacy, that's part of the confusion there. We're going to talk about federal law, specifically that relating to the 501c3s, with I'm sure many of you are, but also some about state law, not about the APOC portion that we're going to hear about later, but really about what individuals have to think about when they engage in this kind of activity. So go ahead, Chris. So I left this slide out, but I realized that I should do just a little bit of an introduction of the Foraker Group. So the Foraker Group is a 501c3. We're the State Nonprofit Association for Alaska, and our mission is pretty simple in words. It's to strengthen nonprofits and tribal organizations, but you know, it turns out, in fact, that it can be pretty complicated. So we offer, you know, a couple of different things to help us with that work. One is education and training. So classes like this, but also, you know, a board series on what it means to be a board member, all the way up to some pretty complicated stuff. And we do what we call organizational development work. It's really consulting. And that is our one-on-one work with organizations of all shapes and sizes in every part of the state. Our third line of business is what we call shared services, and it's really backroom support for nonprofits and community organizations. I call it the we hire really smart, expensive people so nonprofits don't have to service, but you know, that's not really great for marketing, but that's what we do. We have accountants, finance managers, HR professionals, information technology folks, marketing people, because we know that small to medium-sized organizations need that expertise just like the big guys, but it's often hard to find, and if you find it, it's often really expensive. So we're providing backroom accounting services for, I think, about 150 nonprofits right now. And Recover Alaska is actually under our umbrella as part of Sultana, so that's a cool thing. And our final line of business is what I spend most of my time thinking about, and that's our work as the State Nonprofit Association, where we are engaging in research in the sector. So we recently put out a report on gender pay equity gap in the nonprofit sector. Every 3 years, we put out a report on the economic impact of the sector on Alaska's economy. We're currently working on our latest iteration of our salary and benefits survey, which nonprofit leaders find really helpful. But the second part of our work as the State Nonprofit Association is our public policy work. And many years ago, the board and leadership staff of Foraker made the decision that we were no longer going to be what we called reactive advocates in the public policy space. And that really means waiting around until somebody presented something or said something stupid and jumping up and saying, hey, that's not a good idea. That instead to take a much more active and forward-thinking role in public policy. So, you know, we're involved in public policy work at the local level around sales tax and property tax. We're involved in the policy at the state level around budget and legislation for the good of the sector, regulatory change, even intervening in situations where there might be a disagreement between the state and a nonprofit or a subsector, but also at the federal level. So we are involved in lots of policy work at the federal level. And I'm just going to put in a plug for the census. Today is the last day to fill out your census. So if you haven't done that, please do so, 2020census.gov. It's really important for not only the nonprofit sector, but this kind of work that Recover Alaska and its partners are doing, because funding decisions are based largely on those census numbers. So just really quick, I'm going to stop for a second to see if anybody's got a question about Foraker. Thanks for putting that link in there, yes. 10 minutes, 10 questions, 10 years of funding. That's what we say. All right, terrific. So, and I'm going to have Chris send this document out to folks after we're done here. But it's a publication called Stand for Your Mission. If you have the capability, you can just call it up and look at it online. But it's a publication that really talks about why advocacy in the public policy space is important for nonprofit leaders. I've just taken a couple of snippets out, and I'm going to go through those. Decisions are happening all around us that affect our ability to achieve our missions, and we know that it's absolutely true. At the local level, state level, and federal level, people are making public policy decisions that impact our ability to do our work. Sometimes those decisions are made based on ignorance, indifference, or bias. We know that's true as well. We wish that everybody who makes laws knew everything that they needed to know to make the very best policy, but we know that's not true. And by engaging in this public policy advocacy work, we can really educate policymakers to help them do what they really want to do most of the time, and that's really make good public policy. All too often, we are not at the table. And when I say we, that's the nonprofit sector. The saying is that if you're not at the table, you're on the table, meaning, you know, your missions are at risk, your resources are at risk. Another way to say that is that if you're not at the table, you're under the table fighting for scraps. You know, I've got 4 co-workers with me, they're dachshunds, and I know that they know the concept of fighting for scraps under the table. But as nonprofits, we don't really want to do that. We want to be a stronger voice. The fact is, our respective missions will never be fulfilled if we are relegated to accepting the decisions that are made without us. And I think all of us can agree that there are times when if public policymakers knew a little bit more or had a little better understanding of what it is that we do, that public policy could be better. Okay? So next slide, Chris. So we talk about this idea of engaging in public policy work as really building a culture of advocacy within the organization, because we do want to be part, or meaningful part of public policy conversations. So this culture of advocacy does really help policymakers know who we are and what we do and why we do it. It makes for better public policy. Oftentimes we see policy that comes out that's, I put quotes around bad, but maybe it's policy that doesn't address the needs of our particular mission areas. Maybe it's policy that actually hampers our ability to meet our mission. Maybe it's public policy that doesn't even talk about the role of nonprofits and the missions that we think are important. This culture of advocacy is really a way to help produce better policy, because we know from our years of doing this work that when public policymakers know more, they just do make better public policy. And so our job really, from being at the table, by being at the table is to really help policymakers do their work better. So next slide. So you want to use your voice. We want to say you want to use that voice for good and not for evil. I say that not because it's evil that we're trying to undertake, but if our voice is absent, there could be evil coming out of some of these public policy decisions. We are the very best advocates for our mission. There is no better advocate for reducing the harm from substance abuse or alcohol abuse than Recover Alaska and those of you who are on the line here. So we really want to make sure that what we know and what you know about this very important issue gets to the ears of policymakers. There's often a fear, however, that when we engage in this work that it will be seen as partisan, okay? But a culture of advocacy and using your mission or using your voice for mission doesn't mean that you're engaging in partisan politics. And when we say partisan politics, we're really talking about party politics. Does it sometimes have a partisan bent or bias? Sure. But we're not engaging in that with the expectation that we're going to be involved in a partisan process. And so the question often comes up. It's like, okay, well, that sounds great, but how do we do that? How do we build that culture of advocacy within the organization to help us move forward with our mission? Next slide, Chris. So we start building this culture of advocacy really by thinking about three different components of this culture of advocacy. Sometimes I think about them as lenses that we put onto this idea of public policy advocacy in the sector. But we want to all really make sure that I call it embrace our inner advocate. We're going to talk about what that means. It's really important that we have an understanding of the law, because there is some law that we have to pay attention to, and that our work in the public policy space is more strategic. That means we've put together some sort of advocacy plan that helps us sort of envision the future for how we're going to use our voice for good in support of our mission. So next slide, Chris. Okay, so I always like to start this conversation about embracing your inner advocate by saying that you're probably doing this stuff already. You are probably already advocating for your mission in lots of different areas, in front of lots of different groups, in many different venues. So I often ask this question: do you ever tell people about the cool stuff your group, nonprofit, commission, or whatever is doing? And the answer, most of us would be able to say, yeah, we do that, okay? If not, then my question is, why not? It kind of gets back to that concern that Chris expressed, that, are we even allowed to do this work? Short answer is yes. I mean, we even have within our Constitution this expectation, thanks to the work of Thomas Jefferson and others, that people would have the ability to go to government and tell them what they want. Okay? The official term is redress their grievances before government. But we have in the Bill of Rights the ability to go to government and say, this is what we think should happen. And if you extend that to the nonprofit sector or the subsector that you guys are operating in, you have the ability and the right to really go to government and say, this is what we think is a good idea. That could be going before a city council meeting, could be meeting with state legislators, providing testimony, could be meeting with the governor or commissioners, could be meeting with our congressional delegation. And that bullet on the very last bullet is important when we talk about this idea of you being an advocate. If you don't do it, who's going to do it for you? And generally, the answer is nobody. So that's why it's super important to be able to sort of acknowledge.
All right. I'm Teresa Sharp from Human Resources.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, dear. I'm
Please go on mute. Sorry.
For all the facilities, so I start, meeting people, and okay, this.
There we go. So yeah, let's go back to that point. If you don't do it, if you don't advocate for your mission, and in this case, in the public policy environment, who's going to do it for you? Again, answer, probably nobody. Next slide. Hey, Chris, you could actually make me a co-host, and I can probably do these slides for you if you want.
Yeah, sure, we can do that.
Yeah.
And then I'm also going to mute everybody for now, just so we can have a blank slate. And then, Mike, if you can unmute yourself once I do that, that'd be good.
All right, cool.
Okay, you should have the host capabilities now.
Okay, so that means I have to share this screen myself, right?
Yep.
All right. So speak amongst yourselves for a minute while I find this PowerPoint, and I'll get back up. And if you've got a question that has come up just in the first couple of minutes, go ahead and ask that. All right, I'm just getting to the point where I can share this, so hold on a second. All right, so in theory, people can see my slides. Is that true?
No, I can't see it, at least.
Uh-oh. All right. Says I am sharing the screen, Chris.
Yep, it looks good now.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Sorry about that, people. I appreciate your flexibility there. So, like I said, people are sometimes concerned about engaging in this public policy work, whether it's advocacy or lobbying, which we'll talk about the difference here shortly. I present this comic because it really is a great way to illustrate this fear. I'm sorry, could you step a little closer to me? I can't quite hear what you're saying. So by leaning in with your thoughts on recovery or the other aspects of the mission that you're working on, there's that guillotine, maybe you're going to get your head chopped off. That really, there might be a downside. That's a really common fear. What's the downside that happens when I engage in this public policy work? I'm worried. That's a real valid concern on the part of nonprofits. I also use this term, the whack-a-mole factor. For those of you who've ever played whack-a-mole, that you've got this these things that pop up, and your job is to hit them on the head to make them go down, and the more you get, the higher your score. Well, you know, this sort of illustrates the concern that nonprofit organizations have when they engage in advocacy, is that if I put my head up and say something about public policy that I think is wrong or needs to be improved or needs to be addressed, you know, boom, somebody might whack me on top of the head. Who might that be? I don't know. It might be local city council, might be state legislators, might be members of Congress. But these fears, while they're certainly understandable, they're not really very warranted, okay, because we do have the ability to engage in this activity. And I'm going to stop here for a second because I wanted to see if folks have any questions about, you know, this embracing your inner advocate. What does that look like? Where are you on that journey? Has anybody had particular success, you know, or is anybody else like, gosh, we're really worried? Any questions or thoughts? And again, if you want to jump in on the audio or the chat bar, please go ahead and do that. All right, so we've addressed that first lens or first component of that culture of advocacy is in embracing your inner advocate. And, you know, we often get questions like, okay, well, yeah, I'm interested as a nonprofit, but how do I do that? You know, it's everything from establishing a committee as part of your board that's actually dedicated to public policy. It's maybe putting a platform or a plank in your lines of business that talks about the importance of advocacy. You know, some of the nonprofits that we work with, the 501c4s, for instance, or 6s or others, that's really specifically an area that they engage in. But as 3s, we have a little bit more to worry about. And just reading this question, been on the streets protesting, occupying on behalf of homeless folks and nonprofits were by my side. Yeah, yep. And that's an important use of that nonprofit voice. Okay? So one of the things that also helps build or allows an organization or group to embrace this idea of public policy advocacy is really knowing the law. And for some of you on the Zoom here, you're going to recognize this guy, maybe baby boomers like me, but that's Joe Friday from the police procedural called Dragnet. And you know, he was a man of the law, right? It's about the law. And so, you know, I put Joe Friday up there to say, all right, we're going to talk about the law. Part of this conversation about the law is about myth busting, okay? So, you know, I've mentioned this before, and again, Chris brought it up at the beginning. You know, there's this myth that active public policy work on the part of a nonprofit is illegal. And in particular, lobbying is illegal for nonprofits. I mean, I don't know how many times I've heard that. No, we can't do that because it's illegal. I'll define lobbying as a little different, or how it fits into the advocacy environment in just a second, but it's not illegal at all. Okay? And in fact, we've got parts of the Internal Revenue Service Code that deal specifically with nonprofit organizations that say, yeah, you can do some. We'll talk about what that some means. Certainly advocacy or lobbying by individuals who don't have a connection to a nonprofit is not illegal at all. People do it all the time. But when we as an organization want to engage in some of that lobbying activity, we just have to follow some laws, okay? And they're not onerous, they're not overly complicated. but we just have to pay attention. So in order to really have this conversation about the law, we really have to talk about what the law covers. When we say the word advocacy, it really is about, whoops, sorry, too far. When we talk about advocacy, there are really three components to any kind of advocacy. I'm just gonna, hold on, just trying to get my camera view up here, hold on. Oh, I have been off camera this entire time. Why didn't somebody tell me? Sorry. So I'm back, hello. So this idea of advocacy in general is a function of three things. Any kind of advocacy is, one, you have an opinion, okay? That's the first part. Two, you share it with somebody. Three, to change their mind. That's really all advocacy is, whether it's program advocacy, whether it's advocacy before your parents about a new car or going out on Friday night. You have an opinion and you're going to share it with somebody in order to change their minds, okay? So that big pie of advocacy is what that is about. And when I asked that question earlier, do you ever tell people about the cool stuff you're doing? Yeah, okay. Do you do that with the intention of maybe altering their behavior? Probably, okay. But when we enter into that little purple part of the advocacy pie, we call that the lobbying piece of the pie. We have an opinion, okay? So, you know, I know, for instance, Recover Alaska has spent a tremendous amount of time trying to repair state law around things like alcohol licensing. Okay, you have an opinion about that. You share it with somebody, okay? And when you share it with somebody who makes laws, I mean a legislator, okay, with a third intention of changing their mind. Okay, so one, we have an opinion about our mission work, okay? We share it with people who make laws, and this could be people at the city council, could be people in the state legislature, could be members of the congressional delegation, with a specific intent. That intent being to bring about some change in law. So it could be that that change in law is a new law that we want to be put on the books. It could be that it's a lousy law that we want taken off the books. It could be an okay law that really needs some adjustment, okay? But when the people that we're talking to are people that make laws, and we're asking them to do a specific thing with respect to a piece of legislation, that's when we enter that lobbying piece of the pie, okay? And when we do, that's when we have some laws to follow, okay? You know, people often ask, well, where does this word lobbying come from? Well, it's all over IRS code in this particular section that applies to us as nonprofits. But really the word itself comes from Washington, D.C., you know, in the early years in the Capitol, when you could actually walk around the Capitol Rotunda. I don't know if folks have been able to do that. It was kind of a cool journey. But half of the Congress, or the one house of Congress, is in one half of that rotunda, and the other half is in the other half of that rotunda. And what people who had an opinion were doing is they would hang out in the lobby of the Capitol Rotunda, and they would wait for members of the House or the Senate to come out of their particular chambers, and then they would tell them what they want, okay? So that's where that lobbying word comes from, kind of you're catching lawmakers in the lobby. You know, that's the sort of, it's not urban myth, but, you know, it's the sort of mythical way that the word lobbying came into being, but we actually have laws that define lobbying in a pretty simple way. Okay? And this is the one that we're most interested, this is the one that we're most interested in when it comes to your ability to, and your desire to advocate in the public policy environment. So IRS code is pretty clear. It says that lobbying must have, and that's important, must have these three components in order to be considered lobbying and therefore sort of under the auspices of IRS code. First, has to be a communication. Okay, that can be all different kinds of things. It could be an in-person meeting, it could be a phone call, it could be an email, it could be a letter, but it's a communication, okay, to a legislator, okay, and I put in parentheses legislative staffers because they are often the ones who do the bulk of the sort of interaction with nonprofits and others when they go to engage in these lobbying activities. But that's important. It's got to be legislators, right? Legislators defined are people that make laws. So, you know, the questions often come up, well, I'm going to go talk to the mayor about this thing, or I'm going to talk to the governor, or I'm going to talk to the commissioner of health and social services, or I'm going to talk to the president about this thing that's important, and ask him or her to take a particular action. Well, when we engage in those kinds of communications with people who are not legislators, all of a sudden it is no longer, we can no longer classify it as lobbying according to IRS law. Okay? And that's really important because there are often times when we have communication with people who make laws, but there are often times when the nature of our advocacy work causes us to interact with program staff or executive leaders. When we do that, even if we ask them to take a specific action, we're not engaging in lobbying because they are not legislators. I had a question just a couple of weeks ago from a nonprofit. They want to go before the one of the local school boards. So they have something that they want to share with the school board so that the school board takes a specific kind of action with respect to their clients. And they said, so what do we have to know? Do we have to, you know, how do we report our lobbying activities? How do we, you know, record this activity? And I told them, I said, well, according to the IRS, that's not lobbying. They're like, what? Really? And I said, yeah, okay, it's a communication. Yeah, you're asking somebody to take some sort of specific action with respect to programs in the school district, but they're not legislators. Okay? They make policy, they don't make laws. So that's really an important aspect here. So, you know, those many times, and I know that the Recover staff have spent lots and lots of time in Juneau in front of members of the administration trying to bring about some specific kind of action, but that's not lobbying activity because they're not legislators, okay? Third, important, intended to influence specific legislation, okay? So the reason that's important is because we can have all kinds of conversations or all kinds of communications with people who make laws, whether at the local, state, or federal level, but it's not until we're asking them to do something specific with respect to a piece of legislation that it becomes a lobbying activity, okay? And that piece of legislation, I've got a couple of examples here. You know, at the local level, it might be a local ordinance, state statutes, or federal acts. Okay? We could go and have really great communication. We can send communication. We can talk to legislators, but it's not until we ask them to do something specific with respect to a piece of legislation that it becomes lobbying. And again, only when it becomes lobbying do we have to follow these laws. Okay? This is really an important concept, and I hope this really distinguishes for folks this idea of when it becomes lobbying and when it's not lobbying. Most of the advocacy that we're probably engaging in is not lobbying, right? If it doesn't meet all three, it's not lobbying, okay? When we do meet those three criteria, right? Communication to a legislator or staffer with some intent to influence a specific piece of legislation, we do have to follow these laws. And the biggest one is from IRS code, is that we can only lobby to what's called an insubstantial degree. The actual wording is up there. Nonprofit organizations are prohibited from lobbying, and that's often where people stop. They say, oh my God, we can't do that. But the next part of the sentence is super critical, except to an insubstantial degree. All that means is that it can't be a really big part of your mission work, okay? It needs to be, by insubstantial, there are really two ways to determine what insubstantial means, okay? And that's according to IRS code. One is, I call it the squishy test, but it's the insubstantiality test, okay? So the title there is important. It's like, okay, we're going to test through this mechanism to determine whether the lobbying activity that we're engaging in, and this is an expense in terms of expenses, how much you spend, whether it's insubstantial or whether it is substantial, okay? And the insubstantiality test really is, I call it the squishy test, because it essentially says, you look at your total budget, all right? I'm just for illustration purposes, say that we have a budget of $10, right? If we're spending more than about 75 cents of that budget on lobbying activities, we are getting close to that point where it might become more substantial. So if we think of 5 to 8%, and those aren't hard and fast numbers, okay? But if we think about that 5 to 8% of our budget, meaning expenditures that amount to 5 to 8% of our budget, spent on lobbying activities, we are probably pretty comfortably in that insubstantial space. Question from Roger. If we are having an event where all are invited and a politician shows up and shows support, is that lobbying? Good question. Let's go through the matrix here. All right. Is that a communication from you to a legislator? Okay. No, it sounds like it was the other way around. Okay. It sounds like legislator was talking to you. Okay. Is that person a legislator? Yes. Okay. Did you ask that person to veto a bill? I mean, not veto, but vote in favor of a bill, or put a bill in, or oppose a bill, or make some specific change to a bill? Probably not. Okay, so think about it. That was not a lobbying activity at all. I hope that helps, Roger. IRS website, what am I looking at here? Somebody just tell me, because it's going to take me forever to download. Patrick?
Yes, that is from the IRS website, setting out the expenditure test, which is what the CAPLA agency advises us. And essentially what it tells us is that, so we're a $30 million expenditure organization. The lobbying non-taxable amount is $1 million. So what they basically say is we can spend up to that before we qualify as out of the non-taxable amount.
Yeah, and I'm glad you bring that up. My internet is notoriously slow here, so it would take me forever to call that up, but I'm glad you brought that into the conversation, because that's really going to be, you know, after I talk about the other test, the 501H election, you know, I just ask everybody on the line to think about your total budget. You know, Foraker, you know, we're about a $5 million organization, you know. Do the math, okay? We could spend a pretty significant sum of money on lobbying activities. And we would consider that substantial, okay? But the more important sort of determination, though, is whether it fits within either of these tests. So what I'd like to say here is that even though the word insubstantial is in there, the amount that we come up with that allows us to avoid either that taxable piece, but more importantly, a threat to our 501c3 status is pretty big, okay? It's sometimes a lot of money, okay? So this insubstantial amount can be pretty substantial, especially for the 501c3s who really, the vast majority of our budget is about programs and supporting the programs or the services that we're providing. There is another test. It's called the Expenditures test. It's the 501H election. And there's a process to go through that helps you figure out exactly what the amount is. It's called a bright line definition. So rather than say, well, I'm going to be kind of squishy and say I could spend 50, 60, 75 cents of my $10, the expenditures test, the 501H election actually says you go through the process and use their template, and they say you could spend 79 cents, okay, on lobbying activity. For those, and people often ask, well, you know, which one should I use? There's differences of opinion here. If you're not really doing very much of this, meaning you're not engaging in anything even close to a substantial amount of lobbying activity, remember, communication, legislator, influence legislation. If you're not really even close to that substantial number, stick with the squishy test, okay? It really works pretty well. If you're at a point where this is a bigger part of your operation or lobbying is becoming a more important part of your work, then you're going to want to elect, that's why it's called the 501H election, you're going to want to elect to be adjudicated or judged by this other more formal test, which gives you those bright line definitions and an actual number. But, you know, I'm thinking of Patrick, $30 million organization, $1 million in lobbying. That's pretty substantial, okay? And when we're doing a lot of that, we just want to be careful, and that's why we might want to elect to be adjudicated by that 501H election. You know, I'll just share the experience at Foraker. You know, when we were starting out, we were really not at a point where we're doing or spending a lot of money on this work, on this lobbying activity. And so we really felt pretty comfortable with that insubstantial test. But as it became clear that we were doing more of this, and especially as we were bringing on partners under Sultana who were interested in doing more of this, we really wanted to make sure that we were clear on what the amount was. Yeah, it could be between, you know, $250,000 and $400,000, but we want to be really more clear about that. So that's why that 501H election is, or that using that expenditure test is going to be more important for somebody or for us in that space, because we're just getting closer. Anna, my goodness, I haven't heard you. I haven't heard of you in years. Hi, how you doing? How is this different, Anna asked, if I work for a for-profit program? Well, my first response to that is I'm not a lawyer, I don't play one on TV, and we don't provide legal advice. However, having said that, the difference between a for-profit organization that is lobbying and a nonprofit organization that is lobbying are significant. And I would urge you to look a little bit more into that, but I want to really tell you about why that is. That the reason that we have this lobbying, this language around lobbying in IRS code with respect to nonprofits is because we're getting a pretty sweet tax exemption. As a charitable organization, a nonprofit, and that's, you know, any of the 27 nonprofits, 501c, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way to 27. That's the big thing that we all share, no matter what kind of nonprofit we are, is that we get a tax exemption. That tax exemption is from paying corporate income tax, right? So the thinking was that, you know, here we are giving these organizations who are doing good work, right? We're giving them this really great tax exemption. And in fact, in the 501c3s, they're getting an extra tax benefit. That tax benefit being, that extra tax benefit being taking advantage of the charitable giving incentive. So, you know, I think the Congress really said, gosh, if we're giving them all of that cool stuff, we don't want them to be able to then come back to us and spend a lot of time and money and energy taking away from mission to come and lobby, okay? And so that's the general idea or the general reasoning for that. So in the nonprofit sector, we do have some, you know, pretty significant restrictions on lobbying. That doesn't really apply even closely to the nonprofit sector. I hope that answers your question, Anna. But if you want to do a little bit more research to help you with that, that might be a good idea, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. It's good to hear your voice. All right, so as we're moving through this conversation about IRS code, part of what becomes part of this insubstantiality test, whether, again, it's the insubstantiality test or the expenditures test, what we put into that or what is calculated as part of that insubstantial number has to do with the kind of lobbying that you're engaging in. We can actually, according to IRS code, do more of what's called direct lobbying. That means we could spend more money on direct lobbying. So think of direct lobbying as, you know, I am looking at you, legislator, and I am telling you, legislator or legislative staffer, what my opinion is and what I want you to do. Okay, so it's very direct. It's direct communication with somebody on the city council, member of the state legislature, member of Alaska's congressional delegation. Okay, we can do less. Excuse me. We can do less what's called grassroots lobbying, and I classify that. You know, the bullet here is, hey, you, general public, go talk to your legislator and tell that legislator what you want to have happen with respect to a specific piece of legislation. Think about, you know, our last couple of years in the state budget. I don't know if you've heard, we've got kind of a crisis going on. Part of that crisis led to some pretty significant vetoes on the part of the administration. And, you know, one of the things that we generally always see, and, you know, that's because it's a great tactic, it really works much of the time, is, for instance, from public radio. You know, when public radio is threatened in the budget, public radio goes out and says, hey, our budget is being threatened. We're going to suffer a significant loss of funding to provide this important activity or important service. And so we want you, general public, to go contact your legislator and tell him or her not to cut public broadcasting out of the state budget. That is grassroots lobbying, okay? The limits to grassroots lobbying are a little more substantial than the limits in IRS code for direct lobbying. You know, people are like, well, why is that? I've heard different stories. The one that seems to resonate the most is that when the Congress was putting together this legislation, they just felt that this was a potentially more effective form of lobbying. And so they said, gosh, you know, we really want to limit that even a little bit more than we do direct lobbying, okay? This other type of lobbying would really be considered grassroots, but it's a sort of a offshoot. Call it grass tops lobbying. I don't know if people have heard of that phrase before, but it's essentially, rather than going to the general public and saying, talk to your legislator, ask him or her to do this thing, it's really talking to community leaders, thought leaders, opinion leaders, people with particular connections to legislators or staffers. Go talk to your legislator and bring about this certain kind of change. The kinds of expenses that would be associated with grass tops lobbying would really fall under this grassroots lobbying limit. So let's see, question there, what kinds of costs are involved with lobbying? Great question. Couple big ones is travel. Okay, so if we have to get on an airplane in Alaska, you know, we all have to pretty much get on an airplane or a ferry to get to Juneau to talk to our legislators. Hotels, if you're traveling and there's a hotel expense, that could be a cost associated with lobbying. Say your meals, say you're putting together a marketing campaign. Okay, you might be producing documents, you might be producing videos, printing costs, you know, any kind of cost that is associated with your lobbying activity. Staff time. Okay, say that I have been tasked with putting together proposed legislation, okay, and that's happened. That's, you know, we as part of, for instance, Pick, Click, Give, you know, we were asked to put together the initial legislation for Pick, Click, Give. That staff time would qualify as a lobbying expense, because eventually we took that to the legislator, we communicated with them, and we told them it would be a good idea to pass it. Okay, so those are, I guess, the biggest ones. If you're paying a consultant for some grassroots marketing, PSAs or something, you know, that could qualify there. But it, again, any kind of cost that can be directly tied to that lobbying activity. And I hope I'm saying this right, Aisha. Did that help?
Yes, thank you. And you did say it right. Good job.
Okay, cool. All right, so we can do a lot of different things in this lobbying space, or in this space of public policy advocacy that is not necessarily lobbying, so it wouldn't qualify under that member communication legislator about a specific piece of legislation. There's a lot that we can do in the public policy environment that doesn't necessarily fall into that one piece of the pie around lobbying, okay? But there is one thing that we absolutely, utterly, forever and ever can never do, and that's engage in what's called political activity. Now, we can do lots of things, but we can never endorse or oppose a candidate for elected office. And this is particularly timely now, and you know, we did a session in our Advocacy in Action just a couple of weeks ago on some of the realities for nonprofits when they're thinking about how to engage in the elective process, the democratic process. But this is something that we just can't do. Several years ago, the Foraker Group became deeply involved in efforts to preserve what's called the Johnson Amendment. It's part of IRS code proposed originally by then Senator Lyndon Baines Johnson before he became vice president and then president. And the essentials of the Johnson Amendment said that no nonprofit 501c3 charity can engage in political activity. Right? So I've gotten a lot of questions over the course of the last couple of months. Say, you know, can we endorse Senator Sullivan? Can we endorse candidate Al Gross? Can we support or oppose President Trump, Joe Biden? And the answer is no, we just can't do that. But there have been efforts over the last couple of years to really remove the prohibition of the Johnson Amendment, actually deactivate or get rid of the Johnson Amendment to allow nonprofits to engage in that political activity or partisan activity. And we just don't think that's a good idea. It's a huge distraction. It's actually been part of our public policy platform for a number of years. But, so lots of questions come up here. But let's go through this list of things that we can do in this public policy advocacy space and still be not so much within the lobbying pie, some of these are, but really doing a lot of things that are outside that lobbying piece of pie. And I suspect that some of you, or you're familiar with organizations that have done some of these things. Some of them send out a candidate questionnaire. Okay? You send out a questionnaire before the primary that, to everybody, all candidates, and you ask them questions about the issues that are important to you guys. And I'm just going to jump in, and maybe Tiffany or Chris, you can respond to this. Is this something that Recover has done, sort of candidate questionnaires? Okay? I just don't remember if that was on the list of the things that you had done before.
We have tried to work with other partners to give a couple of questions into their candidate questionnaires. We've never put one on, we've never hosted a forum or put out our own questionnaire just on our own.
Okay, that's what I thought. And you know, I'm sharing this experience at Foraker. We did the same thing around the governor's election with census questions. We really asked some of our partners to ask those questions. But we could do that legitimately as a nonprofit and not be in trouble. Okay, we could put on forums. A lot of nonprofits put on forums. I mean, we see this a lot from chambers and other organizations nonprofits where they invite candidates in and ask candidates questions. Not so much a debate, okay, but really asking questions of candidates. Nonprofits can engage in voter registration activities, and that's important. It's got to be nonpartisan voter registration activities. You know, there are stories of nonprofits who have engaged, and this is across the country, who engaged in voter registration that was specifically targeting one party or another. Okay, so this one particular organization, they went out and they targeted all Democrats. They wanted to make sure that all people who were Democrats had a current registration and that they were going to vote on election day. While that is, you know, squishy in the partisan area, I think that is something that we must stay away from because there's certainly an implication about partisanship there. So just be careful. But nonpartisan voter registration, absolutely doable. Get out the vote, same thing. As long as we're doing that in a nonpartisan way. Organization in Alaska, nonprofit, a bunch of years ago, they took their buses and they went around the community and they were picking up voters to take them to the polls. It just happened that they were only picking up Democrats. So, is that a partisan activity? You know, I think certainly the implication is there, so we want to be careful. Some nonprofits put out voter guides, you know, ask questions, put out a guide, don't make a recommendation. Okay? We can support or oppose ballot initiatives. So, you know, this year we have 2 ballot initiatives, 1 and 2, and we've been getting a lot of questions about, well, gosh, I'm a nonprofit. Can I put a message of support for ballot initiative 1? Okay, I want to support, or I want people to vote no on ballot initiative 1 about taxing the oil companies, because I think it's going to have a negative effect on the nonprofit sector and the economy. Okay, the truth is that you can express your support or opposition for that as a nonprofit, okay, because it's not a candidate for political office. The counsel that you know, we've been providing is just think long and hard about, you know, whether you want to be associated with that particular activity. But we have seen a couple of nonprofits that have come out in support and some in opposition. So, but that's perfectly legitimate, okay? And that is a lobbying expense. It's like, well, wait a second. How could that be a lobbying expense? Let's go through Mike's 3 things. 1, a communication. 2, to a legislator. 3, attempting to influence specific legislation. Well, it's certainly a communication, okay? But wait a minute, those people aren't legislators, are they? They're just members of the public, okay? But in truth, the initiative process really makes citizens legislators, okay? Because you're being asked to vote on this piece of legislation, and if you vote yes, if enough vote yes, it passes, and if enough vote no, it doesn't pass. So it is actually a proposed piece of legislation, and you're citizen legislators here, okay? So any kind of expense that is associated with your support or opposition of a ballot initiative, that is going to be a lobbying expense. Again, perfectly legitimate, just got to be insubstantial with respect to your overall budget, okay? I've already covered the rides to the polls, candidate visits and educations. We get this question a lot. You know, what if I invite legislators, and I'm on the board of the Food Bank and Fairbanks, have been for a long time, and we invite members of, or candidates to come and visit our place. And people might say, well, wait a second, that sounds like a partisan activity. Well, what happens is we invite everybody, okay? Everybody wants to come, great. If only a couple choose to come, that's terrific too. But we have put out the invitation to everybody, especially as we're getting closer to the election. It becomes even more important to be thoughtful about even inviting incumbents. Okay, well, I want to invite Senator Sullivan to come to the food bank just because he's a senator and he could be supportive of our efforts to feed hungry people. Okay, but as we get closer to the election, that simply invitation could be construed as a partisan activity. Okay, and finally, issue advocacy, which is all over the place in the rest of that pie. Remember, you have an opinion, you're sharing it with somebody, change their mind, okay? You're not actually necessarily asking them to put forward or oppose or modify a piece of legislation. You just might be wanting them to think more about the negative impacts of substance abuse or alcoholism in future legislation, okay? Not something that is really tied to any particular piece of legislation, but a general issue, okay? So I want to stop there for just a second to say, any thoughts from folks or any questions? Again, jump in the chat bar or on the audio. about some of these activities, or maybe others that you have engaged in that maybe have been really hugely successful, or something that you've tried that maybe, well, gosh, that didn't work so well. Any thoughts on this list, or the idea of endorsement? And I have one more thing to say about endorsement. I'll wait for that, see if we have any questions. Okay, again, if you've got a question, jump in on the chat bar, it's fine. So over the course of the last year, we've actually I've gotten a lot of questions about whether a nonprofit organization could support or oppose the recall effort for Governor Dunleavy. And it's a recall initiative, okay, so, it's something where we're, as citizens, being asked to vote for this. It's not an actual election, okay, but the counsel that we have gotten, not only from our legal team, but also nonprofit minds across the country, is just to stay away from that activity, because it could be construed as a partisan activity, just something to be careful of. And I wanted to make sure I addressed that, because we have been getting lots and lots of questions. Okay, so we spent a lot of time talking about the Internal Revenue Service, because quite frankly, that's the one that we have to spend most of the time paying attention to. And I hope I talk a little bit about state law here, and if I have a weird interpretation and APOC says, hey, what are you talking about? Go ahead and jump in and tell me, okay? But who cares about lobbying? There are two things that we need to pay attention to in this lobbying space. One is the federal law that we've been spending a lot of time on, and that's really about expenses. Okay, the IRS only cares about how much the organization spends, and that it is insubstantial, okay? A couple of important words there. Organization. It only cares about money the organization spends, and that it remains insubstantial, okay? So organization and spends, organization and money, okay? That's what the IRS is most concerned about. When we fill out the lobbying portion of the 990, that's what we put in there. Okay? We put in how much money we've spent. However, there are, laws in Alaska that deal specifically with lobbying activities by individuals, okay? Not organizations, but individuals. And Alaska law is really concerned about how much time individuals spend. So think about that. Lobbying activities. IRS, organization, how much money it spends. State law, individuals, how much time you spend. Okay? So I want to go through a little bit on state law here, because this is often something that confuses people too. Yeah, we have to pay attention to the IRS code, but we also really want to make sure that we're paying attention as individuals, not organizations, to the Alaska state law. So Alaska law says that if any citizen can lobby government, but if you do more of that than 10 hours in a 30-day period, you need to register with the Alaska Public Offices Commission, or APOC, okay? There are different kinds of lobbying or sort of lobbyist classifications. And the thing that's really interesting about state law is that while IRS really, remember, communication to legislators, state law is really talking about communication to legislators and those who are responsible for administration activities, so that's governor, commissioner, so on and so forth, very different from IRS. Not only different in that it's not about the organization and how much it spends, but it's about the time individuals spend, not only with legislators trying to influence legislation, but also trying to influence administrative action. So, you know, quite a bit different, but again, it's really only applying to individuals. You could be classified as a professional lobbyist. That means it's your job. Representational lobbyist, meaning you're representing some other interest, or just a volunteer. There's no specific requirements around this lobbying activity for nonprofit organizations. Okay, so this is important. So I'm the Vice President of Public Policy at the Foraker Group, as you know from the introduction. And you might think from that title that, wow, gosh, why? I heard that Mike Walsh, Dr. Mike Walsh, is not registered as a lobbyist with the state of Alaska. It's like, okay, well, why is that? Well, it's because rarely would I even come close to spending 10 hours in that 30-day period in that specific activity. Okay? I actually keep track. I actually keep track of my time. During the legislative session, sometimes it comes close, okay? But rarely. You know, another interesting thing about Alaska state law is that this number used to be 40 hours. 40 hours in a 30-day period. And what the state was really finding is that, gosh, they weren't catching very many people. There weren't many people who could even come close to that 40-hour mark. Okay? But now that law was changed to be 10 hours. Is anybody on the line here registered as a lobbyist with the state? Just curious. I'm just waiting for a second to see if the chat bar populates or somebody drops in. And actually, this is my expectation. You know, we get a group of people, and Tiffany. If Tiffany says not me, okay, Tiffany probably you probably get the same kind of questions like, well, gosh, Tiffany's down in Juneau all the time. Why isn't she registered as a lobbyist? Well, because hitting that 10-hour mark is sometimes pretty difficult. One legislator shared a story a couple of years ago that he asked a nonprofit executive who had been in the Capitol for like 5 days, right? Roaming the halls, which is, you know, part of the legislative strategy when you're in the Capitol. And the legislator asked this nonprofit leader, says, well, I went to look at the APOC lobbyist registrations and you're not on there, but you've been here for a whole week. Like the nonprofit leader, who is very smart and had to answer this question before, said, yes, but, you know, just sitting here in the hallway, cruising around up and down the stairs, sitting in on a committee meeting, that doesn't qualify, okay, because you're not influencing legislative or administrative action. So, you know, what I like to say is the time that you hang out in the halls of the Capitol doesn't necessarily count toward that 10 hours. So I'm looking, and I'm not registered, but a question, would this include, say, emailing your legislator as a private citizen with a comment on a legislative bill, for example? If you do this a lot, spend a few hours on it. Yeah, you know, we have an expert from APOC on here. I don't know if you want to jump in on this, but the way that I generally answer this question is that, yes, if you're an individual and that time that you spend doing that equates to more than 10 hours in a 30-day period, you would probably want to register. And then I'm thinking, wow, that's a lot of time, okay? You might spend a few hours during that 30-day period, but are you coming close to 10? Most of us probably not, Okay, so that's why this list is often not really very long. Okay? Final thing about Alaska state law. Again, IRS is about the amount of money an organization spends. Okay? State law is about the amount of time an individual spends. The funny thing about state law is it actually only applies to those activities at the state level, whereas the IRS code applies to how much money you spend in the activities at the local level, the state level, and the federal level. Okay. All right, something popped in the chat bar from Anna. When I was doing advocacy work as part of my previous job, I had to track my time to make sure I was under the time requirement. I came within 15 minutes one year. Yep. And if you can track that, that's great. Okay. Tiffany, 2 years ago, I went to Juneau 7 or 8 times for 2 to 5 days at a time. I tracked it very closely. 8 hours, 42 minutes. Yeah. Even, and that's I'm glad you both brought that up, because even with some, pretty intense activity when you're down in Juneau, it's really hard for many of us to get to that 10 hours in a 30-day period. Okay? $10 hours of what? Okay, what might qualify? And if folks have ideas about what they think qualifies that are different, please jump in. Meetings, phone calls, emails, testifying, uninvited, testifying uninvited. Okay, there's an interesting twist in the IRS code that identifies, and we didn't do it during this course because it would take up a lot more time, but activities that kind of look like lobbying but really aren't. One of those activities is if you're invited in writing by a legislative body to provide testimony, even if you're communicating with legislators and asking them to do something specific with a piece of legislation, it's not lobbying because you've been invited to do that. There's also something called self-defense lobbying. If you're going to Juneau to fight for the very existence of your organization, then that would not necessarily be considered lobbying. Lots of different activities that might live under that list, okay? But Anna jumps in, legislative visits, testimony, yes, okay? Working with administrative officials, legislators on new or pending legislation, okay? And there's that one last big piece there. How about hanging out in the hallway? No, okay? It's only when we're engaging in that sort of specific activity. Okay, I want to stop there before we move on to the third lens, or third component of this culture of advocacy. Any thoughts on this idea of the law? Any confusion? Anything that you say, I didn't know that, or any questions? Oh, great, Anna, yeah, good. Draft regulations, correct? Submitting a public comment on a draft regulation be lobbying? It would be no. Well, let me answer. I'm going to answer that question from an IRS perspective and then from a state law perspective. So the IRS would not consider that lobbying because it is not a communication to legislators, okay? When you say draft regulations, that means it comes out of the executive branch, comes out of an executive office. And so IRS doesn't care about that because it's not a legislator. State law, looking at 10 hours of activity that would be influencing legislative or administrative action, yes, that could potentially be on the list of things that would qualify as a lobbying activity. For you as an individual, Anna, so great observation, but no, nothing that would land on your list as a lobbying expense for the IRS. And Tiffany, question, what about working directly with a legislator on a bill? Need to count every minute of time with them? I think you could be judicious here, Tiffany. You could really talk about recording the specific time that you're talking about or fashioning proposed legislation. But I think that's a call that you would have to make as an individual. If you're sitting in the office for an hour, would you count the hour? No, not necessarily. Yeah, you chit-chatted for 10 minutes and you talked about something else for another 5, and maybe for half an hour you worked on a specific piece of legislation, and then there was wrap-up about other things. So you would record those 30 minutes. Okay. Leslie, I had no idea about that law. Thank you. Yeah, state law, I imagine you're talking about. Yeah, a lot of us don't know about this. Any other thoughts? Okay. So this third part of building this culture of advocacy is about the advocacy plan. So as you recall, right, we have 3 components. 1, embrace your inner advocate. And that sometimes translates to really helping boards understand the importance of lobbying. 2, understanding the law, state law, federal law. But then 3, really being pretty strategic about your advocacy activity. We really recommend that organizations or groups that are thinking about engaging in this advocacy in the public policy space do so with, you know, some sort of plan in place. It doesn't mean you have to make a, you know, a 40-page strategic plan document or something like that, but really just here's what we think we're going to do, here's who we're going to talk to, so on and so forth. I'm going to go through each of these, but Tiffany popped up, so maybe Tiffany's trying to say something. No? All right. It's like Tiffany has this little yellow around your box, and that means, oh, somebody, okay, all right, all right. So, what is involved in an advocacy plan? Okay, a couple things. Oops, went too far. So the first thing that we want to think about in an advocacy plan is, what do we want? We got to articulate a goal. So for Pick, Click, Give, for instance, when Foraker was engaging in activity around Pick, Click, Give, to start it, our goal was to put that piece of, or make that an Alaska state statute that somebody could choose a portion, to give a portion of their permanent fund dividend to a qualified nonprofit, okay? So that was our goal, is to get that thing passed. We have engaged in lobbying activities since then that are more aimed at preserving the charitable foundation of Pick, Click, Give. So for instance, 3 years ago, there was 2 or 3 years ago an effort to really say that state agencies could participate in the Pick, Click, Give. Okay, various state agencies would want to be on that list so that you could make a donation through the permanent fund dividend. And we ended up doing some pretty significant lobbying with some of our partners to say we don't think that's a good idea. We were having communications with legislators about opposing certain pieces of legislation. Our goal then was to preserve the charitable intent of the Pick, Click, Give program. Okay? So we went into it with a specific goal. What is the outcome? Sometimes those goals are about new legislation. Maybe there isn't a piece in existence and your goal is to get one in place. Okay? Sometimes a goal in an advocacy plan is about preventing a piece of legislation from being enacted. Sometimes a goal is about modifying a piece of existing state law or modifying a piece of state legislation or local ordinance, federal act. Okay? So we always really want to go into this with a goal. And so I called on you, Tiffany, just a minute ago inadvertently, but maybe you could talk about the goals of Recover Alaska. What are the top 2 or 3 things that you want to see out of your public policy advocacy work?
Well, Mike, I'm glad you asked. We currently have a 113-page bill that we are trying to get passed. So there are quite a few priorities within that bill, and it's a giant package we've been working on for the past 8.5 years now, the whole time I've been at Recover Alaska. And so usually our advocacy plan that I submit to Sultana as being under that fiscal sponsorship is related to that one bill. But we always have secondary goals and that one rewrites and revises much of Title IV, so all of the alcohol laws in the state. But we also always keep an eye on funding for behavioral health and mental health and treatment and prevention. And so we usually spend less, but still some time advocating for that. We also always try to be reactive to laws that we see come up. And so we include a little bit of kind of time and capacity to be reactive to new things we might not know about at the beginning of session. And then more recently, we've started looking at local laws and policy changes as well. For example, the alcohol tax in Anchorage that passed this spring. And so when we think about our full year, we try to think about state level, federal level. We do try to think about writing letters to support or oppose regulations, even though that wouldn't technically be lobbying. So we try to look at the whole advocacy plan outside of lobbying, so all education and advocacy as well as lobbying, so we can try to figure out how to dole out our capacity and resources.
Cool. I'm glad you answered it that way, because it's, and this is me inadvertently forgetting to add this on, that this is an advocacy plan that isn't just about influencing legislators, okay? That we have in an advocacy plan, we may have goals that are beyond legislators to include the public, to include other stakeholders, to include financial supporters. I mean, so an advocacy plan is, some of it is going to be likely about lobbying, specific communication to a legislator, asking him or her to take a specific action. But these are can be bigger and broader than that. So I'm glad you brought that up. Okay. Excellent. Anybody else have a particular goal in mind? Oh, go ahead, Tiffany.
I was just going to say, I answered the question without reading all of the stair steps of your ladder. I just read advocacy plan. And so I'm realizing that you were asking about one specific thing at a time. So just to say, we also try to do that, like the alcohol tax, for example. Then we did follow this very specific, for this particular goal, who do we need to talk to? What partners do we need? You know, how can we get there? So just to say, we do both the big and the small versions.
Cool. Thanks for that. I was going to make a crass comment. You're so fired, but no, okay, we're not going to do that. So, goal. Does anybody else want to share a particular goal that they might, you don't have to have an advocacy plan, but if you're thinking about advocacy in this public policy space, anybody have a goal, and just drop it into the chat bar, because I've got about another 20 minutes or so, 10 minutes. I want to make sure we leave some time for questions, but anybody have any particular goals in mind when it comes to the advocacy in the public policy space? And I'll go ahead and jump to the next piece of an advocacy plan is we have to ask about audience. Who, you know, that generally translates to who can give this to us? Who can help us achieve this goal? You know, for many of our activities, it might just be specific legislators. It might be legislators on a particular side of the aisle. It might be legislators in a particular body, the House or the Senate. Could be legislators on a specific committee. You know, maybe we want to try to influence a piece of legislation even before it gets proposed. Okay, so it's who can give it to us. Some larger parts of a advocacy plan might be who can give it to us, business leaders, restaurant owners, unions, healthcare providers, but who can help us get to that goal? I'm just going to catch up on the chat bar here. Hold on a second. Oh, not a lot of catch-up necessary. Will these slides be sent to the group? And I'm going to give that to Chris. I'm happy. I'm fine getting these slides out. So totally fine with that, Chris. And it will be on the recording anyway, so you can get to it that way. All right, so who can give it to us? We want to tailor our advocacy plan to our audience. And, you know, I'm just thinking about some of the realities of the sort of the continuing public policy work of Recover Alaska, that, you know, you had different kinds of audiences that you had to work with, right? You had business, you had some of the business associations that, you know, serve alcohol. You had legislators, you had healthcare providers, lots of different audiences that have been involved in some of that work. Okay? All right, once we figure that out, depending on who that audience is, then we have to figure out what they need to hear. What is the message? Is it a message about, is it a general message about building better public policy? Is it a specific message about an existing piece of legislation? Is it a message about putting forward new legislation? What do they need to hear from us? Sometimes, you know, this is where there's a real struggle when you're trying to figure out what to say to legislators, for instance, right? Do you go into legislators with the same message for everybody? Not necessarily, because sometimes the messages need to be a little different depending not only on party affiliation, location in state, their experiences. So for instance, when we were talking about preserving or initiating Pick, Click, Give and then preserving it along the way, we really wanted to get a sense of what legislators had, what kinds of connections to nonprofits that had been on the list. Because what we wanted to share with them is that this would be a significant piece of the long-term sustainability of some of these nonprofit organizations that you are really deeply connected to. Maybe you're on the board, maybe you've donated, maybe it's a nonprofit that's in your community, serving your community members, okay? But the message that we give sometimes is different based on that audience. What do they need to hear? I mean, who do they need to hear from? I'm sorry, my chat bar is in front of my advocacy plan. I had to move it out of the way. It's about delivery. So sometimes I talk here about the usual suspects. This isn't about the usual suspects. So when we say that, we're really saying who can deliver this message in a way that would be more effective and help us reach our goal to get that message to the audience that we've identified, okay? And so it might be that this is where people start to use this, or utilize the concept of grassroots lobbying versus direct lobbying or utilizing grass tops lobbying, that there are times when it might be certain voices that will get the attention of a particular legislator, whereas others may not. So, you know, I'm just thinking about a lot of the state law that came about regarding public smoking in public, right? One aspect of the advocacy plan there was to get business owners to go to the legislature and say, this is a good thing. Limiting indoor smoking is a good thing and it won't hurt my business. Okay? And that was a significant part of the success there, is when those, when members of the legislature were hearing from not your usual suspects. Okay? So oftentimes you think about usual suspects as the executive director of the organization. And it's usually always the executive director of the organization that goes to testify or has the meetings, so on and so forth. But one of the things we found at Foraker is that when we bring in board members, or when board members are part of the conversation, sometimes the reception is quite a bit different. Oh yeah, you know, that's Lori and Mike from the Foraker Group. Yeah, they're going to talk about nonprofit stuff because they're the Nonprofit State Association. But when we get others on our board who aren't really necessarily in the weeds day to day in nonprofit advocacy, sometimes that resonates a little differently. Okay? So think about your delivery. When do we talk to them? Timing. So this is often about when do we engage in these advocacy activities. Ideally, the greatest success comes when you could prevent a stupid bill from being introduced in the first place. Okay? So we found out over our history that if we can influence legislation before it even becomes legislation, that's a great thing. It could be that the message is don't even put this forward, right? Or if you're considering putting this forward, think about it this way. Think about it during the summer when you were thinking about what your pre-file bill might be. Okay? Because that's part of the legislative process, is that legislators can pre-file bills before the legislative session starts. So maybe we spend time before that to help them put together a piece of legislation that is going to help us reach our goal. Maybe it's helping them modify legislation. Okay? During the legislative session, we often talk about and I mentioned this a little bit ago, we often talk about the importance of engaging in the committee process, because the reality is that for a piece of legislation to make it through the state legislature, it is introduced by the member. It is assigned sometimes 2, 3, or more committee assignments, ending up with the finance committee before it goes to the full legislature. So to the greatest extent possible, if we can influence in that committee structure to make modifications, that is part of some real significant success. And I know that that's something that Recover Alaska really spends a lot of time on, is trying to get to those pieces of legislation in the committee process. Correct, Tiffany? Yeah. Okay. And what you're doing in that committee process is you're really trying to build what we call legislative champions, people who can, so it's not just you banging on the door saying, do this, it's legislative champions who can sort of take on your call, where they say, carry your water, to help move the process forward. So when we put forward Pick, Click, Give initially, we had to identify, we identified 2 Senate members, 1 Democrat, 1 Republican, 2 members of the House, 1 Democrat, Republican, to help carry our water on Pick, Click, Give, and we're pretty sure that that is what enabled us to get that thing passed. Okay? And finally, how do we get them to hear it? Is it direct testimony? Is it a fancy commercial to the citizens? Is it a big letter campaign? Is it postcards? You know, I think all of us have probably at one time or another signed those postcards that say, legislator so-and-so, do this or don't do this, and you put your name in and you put it in the mail, and then the legislator shows this big stack of postcards, right? Okay, but the method that you use, they're differently successful based on where you are in the process, where who's delivering, what the messaging is, and who the audience is, and what the goal is. So, you know, our job today wasn't to help you put together a plan, but we are, I mean, that's something that we help with a lot, is trying to figure out, help nonprofits figure out how to build these advocacy plans. The last thing I'm going to say is that sometimes you just got to be ready. So yes, this is a plan, this is a process, and we've tried to think a lot of things out in advance, but boom, something happens that you didn't anticipate, and being able to respond very quickly can be hugely important. So one of the things that our board at Foraker does is they've given our public policy committee pretty significant latitude in being able to respond in a timely manner when stuff comes up. Because think about it. Oh, we've got a hearing tomorrow we have to be at. And this is our message. Well, if we have to put that message together, send it to the Public Policy Committee, get it approved, bring it to the next governance board meeting, which isn't for another 2.5 months, we've lost the opportunity. So there's some real value in flexibility. So Chris and Tiffany, that's about it. That's it for me. Great questions. And I imagine, Chris, that you would be able to share my email if folks have other follow-up questions. Sometimes people don't want to ask questions on the Zoom format, but or if you got something more detailed, happy to help. Thank you for the invitation, Chris and Tiffany. Appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you, Mike, for presenting. And yes, I plan on sharing your email afterwards to all those who attend. Mike also gave us permission to share these slides as well, and we are recording this session, so yeah, we will also send those onto the email as well as posting it to our website. So thank you, Mike. Appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome.
Okay, so right now we are closing in at 2:50. Around, let's say, 3 o'clock. 3 o'clock, we'll take a little break, and at 3 o'clock, Teri can come on and begin her session. So yeah, please feel free to take a little bio break, and we'll see you back at 3. Thank you.
Show at the end. So thanks for having that up. So just as a point of introduction, my name is Teri Tibbett. I'm the advocacy coordinator for the Alaska Mental Health Board and the advisory board on alcoholism and drug abuse. But I also coordinate the joint advocacy effort of the Alaska Mental Health Trust and the partner advisory boards, which include our boards, the Mental Health Board, the Drug and Alcohol Board, but also the excuse me, Governor's Council on Disabilities and Special Education and the Alaska Commission on Aging. We do trainings throughout the year. We hope to really educate as many people with lived experience, as well as administrators and providers and family members, on the importance of getting their voices to policymakers. So to do what Mike Walsh suggested was a real critical thing, and that is to get your voices to policymakers so we can educate them about our issues and help them make better informed decisions. So with that, Just as a little bit of background, I was a legislative aide for 10 years. I worked with the Alaska State Legislature for 3 different legislators. I also did some lobbying after that before I got this job, which I've held for 12 years. So my world has been advocacy for the last 25 years. And from my experience as a legislative aide, I really saw what was the thing that moved legislators. And that, hands down, was the personal story. You could go to the next slide. We're going to get into my description of the personal story, but first I just want to kind of reiterate what Mike was saying, is that we as citizens have the power, we have the right and the power to communicate our opinion, to make recommendations for what we believe. Policymakers are elected to serve us, the citizens. So sometimes you get into a situation with a policymaker where they're making you feel like they're the boss, and you're the, you're the one that's supposed to be quiet and listen. But it really is the opposite. We are the bosses. The citizens, we are the bosses. They are our employees. We've elected them to do our bidding. So it's a mental thing you have to have when you start to think about going to meet or talk with a policymaker. So let's go to the next one. Again, it's the role of the policymakers to work for the citizens of the community, but it's also our responsibility as citizens to move in and communicate what we need. Very, very important. We need to know we have that power, and then we need to use that power. And you can go next. So the cornerstone, again, is telling your story. As a citizen, that's what we have. We may not have charts, we may not have research, we may not have a report or a bottom line to share, but we do have a personal story, and that has a lot of power and can have a lot of impact. So this is the photograph here is a group of youth who came down to Juneau a few years back to tell their story of being in foster care and the things that they recommended after foster care, transitional services and that sort of thing. We did some advocacy training, and then they went up to the Capitol and presented before the House Health and Social Services Committee. So that's those youth. Let's go to the next slide. So the value of the personal story. So this is a picture of Senator John Coghill in his office in Fairbanks, having a conversation with some constituents. The thing that everybody keep in mind that policymakers hear a lot of opinions all day long. They hear it in committee, they hear people coming into their office, they read letters and emails. There's tons and tons of information coming at them with opinions and suggestions and recommendations. So one of the things that personal stories do of a personal experience is it gets their attention because it's unique. It's different from, again, from those charts and those reports and those bottom line opinions and asks that business owners have and that agency professionals might have. So a personal story stands out because it's different, but also it helps paint a picture of the issues that are happening within a legislator's district. I mean, a legislator has however many people living in his district, constituents, and he or she cannot get to know each one of them. So when you go into their office and share your story, you open up their perspective to a side of life they may not have known before. So that's another reason why the personal story is important. Let's go to the next one. So again, I think policymakers, they're interested in our stories, again, because they want to know who their constituents are and what are the concerns of their constituents. I've never met a legislator in all of my years working at the state capitol that didn't care about their constituents. I mean, not only do they care about people's lives for the most part, but they also care about getting reelected. So the more you care about people and show them you care, the more they're likely to like you and to keep voting for you. So it pays to pay attention to and care about your constituents. Again, people who live in a policymaker's district have the power to vote, and it's the policymaker's best interest to listen to their voters in their district. And we can go next. So what are personal stories? When we do our trainings, we often hear from people, well, I work for a provider agency. I can't tell my personal story. Well, here's some choices. You can tell your own story as a person with lived experience, or you can tell your experience or observations as a family member of a person with lived experience. And again, well, not again, but for the first time, and I'm going to repeat this later, if you're going to tell somebody else's story, you need to get permission from them first to do that. You can't, it's not good practice to tell someone else's story without their permission. The third personal story can be an experience of a person you know with their permission, or it can be a composite of people you know or work with. And then in that case, if you're kind of putting them all together into a block, like a hypothetical person, you wouldn't need permission, obviously, because you're not really taking one specific story. And again, a hypothetical story based on real experiences. These are all choices that we can make based on, what our personal experiences and how much we want to reveal about ourselves or about people we work with. So you want to go to the next one? So sharing your story. There's 3 basic elements that we teach in our trainings, and that is 1, introduce yourself. You need to say where you live. You need to say your name, obviously your name, where you live, and what your topic is. And that kind of, if you're speaking on the record like this guy is in a public testimony situation, then you definitely have to say your name for the record because they're writing that down or recording it. You also need to say where you live because that helps legislators understand if you're a constituent or not. And they want to know that because if you're a constituent, they're going to pay more close attention to what you're saying. And then your topic. And that sort of gives context to what you're about to speak about. It's really helpful just to offer those 3 things. The next is telling your story, your personal story, and you want to include challenges and successes, and we'll get more into this in a minute. And you want to use personal examples. And again, we'll get more into that, but personal examples paint a picture. There's this thing about, I took creative writing for a long time, and there's this thing, you want to show what happened, you don't want to tell what happened. And it's because it creates a visual in people's minds, and it's just more enticing, it's a more attractive way to get someone's attention is by showing them details as opposed to just saying, I had a rough life. It's just a lot better to paint the picture of, well, I had a rough life, but it's because X, Y, and Z, that sort of thing. And again, we'll talk about this more in a second. So then the third piece of telling your story is to make an ask. You want to give the policymaker an idea of what they can do to fix the problem. And then the overarching point in all of this is to keep it to 2 to 3 minutes. And the reason I say that is because if you're going to give public testimony, you only have 2 or 3 minutes in a public setting. They have a time limit, they have an alarm that goes off, and you get cut off. And if you're giving your whole life story, you might only get into your to when you were a toddler before it's over and you didn't get to make your point. So really, it's really about keeping it short and sweet and practicing it ahead of time so that you can keep it in a 2 or 3 minute window. It's the same if you're going to visit with a legislator and have a meeting with that legislator in person. Keep it to 2 to 3 minutes, and then you can spend the rest of your time kind of problem solving and going back and forth and discussing the issue, hearing their perspective. You're likely only going to get about 15 minutes with a policymaker in person. And again, we're not doing in person so much anymore, but on the phone, you're not going to get a whole lot of time. So you really want to practice condensing your whole introduction, telling your story, and ask into 2 or 3 minutes. So we can go to the next slide. So this is sort of the drill down on those 3 elements. Again, tell your name and city or village or town, and let it because it lets the policymaker know if you're a constituent or not. Something I didn't mention in the other the slide before was telling who you represent. So someone asked this question when Mike was presenting, what if you're representing yourself? Or what if you're representing an organization? Well, there's two different ways to approach if you're doing one or the other. If you're going to represent an organization, you absolutely have to have permission from that organization. They have to know you're going to do it, unless you're the owner of the organization, obviously. But if it's never okay to go to a public hearing and say, "Hi, I'm here. I'm representing Recover Alaska," blah blah blah, without talking to the people at Recover Alaska. It's just, you really have to have that permission. So if you're going to represent an organization, get permission first. But if you're going to represent yourself, then you can represent yourself anytime. You just have to make sure you say you're representing yourself, especially if you work for an organization, so that they're not confused that you are, whether or not you're representing the organization or not. So, like again, here an example is, hi, I'm a person in recovery. I am a family member with a mental illness. I am an addiction counselor. But we're going to see later how we can phrase that, but it's like, hi, my name is Teri Tibbett. I work for, well, no, I have examples. I don't want to come up with one off the top of my head. I'll blow it for sure. So we'll get into those in a second. So then the last thing is, give one sentence about what you're there to talk about. I'm here to talk about community support services, or I'm here to talk about peer support, or whatever it is. So let's go to number 2. So here's an example, 2 examples of an introduction. And I'm just going to read them to you. Close your eyes and listen to them so that you can get the best impact. You can read if you're a reader, but I recommend just listening. Hi, my name is Rachel Williams. I'm 19 years old and I live in Sitka, Alaska. I was in residential psychiatric treatment for 1 year and was recently diagnosed with bipolar disorder. I work for XYZ Mental Health as a peer support specialist, but I'm here representing myself. I would like to talk about community support services for people with mental illness. Okay, so that hits all the marks that I mentioned. Okay, here's Justin's intro. My name is Justin Bello. I live in Anchorage and I am the Director of Services for Anchorage Street Clinic. I am here representing the clinic and plan to talk about behavioral health treatment and recovery grants. Okay, so 2 distinct, one's representing themselves, one's representing an organization, and we're going to hear more of their story in a second, but let's go to the next slide. So here are some parameters for telling your story. You want to explain some of the challenges that you've had. It's very important to point this out. Because you want them to, you know, speaking just bluntly, that's like a hook. Challenges and struggles that people have, it's like a hook. It draws people in. But you don't want to spend the whole time you're talking about your challenges, because the real goal is to get them to see what's possible and to see what success means and to see what you want them to do. So if you're just spending the whole time on what's wrong with the system, what's wrong with people's lives, what's wrong, they're never going to get to the point where they see what they need to work toward. So really, you want to keep the challenges section short. And again, don't give your full life story, because there's just not going to be enough time. So, and when we do our trainings, we do actually have, we break it down so that you're practicing this and you get help from people around you in how to condense it if you're giving too much information. So the second one is describe what's been successful and what works. And to me, this is the most important piece, because it gives people an idea of what's possible. So like, for example, what services have helped you or the people you serve? What solutions would you recommend to the policymaker? And it's really important that they see that success is possible, because then they feel hopeful and like, well, maybe there is something we can do about this problem. Okay, and then again, like I mentioned before, using personal examples is really important. Show the policymaker what your life is like. Give actual experiences to paint a picture of yours or your client's challenges. And this helps the policymaker connect with you personally, but also helps them see what you experience. And I think that's just really important that they see, they get the visual. So be mindful of how much you are comfortable sharing publicly. This is really important. I had somebody that I was working with, we did some training, and she gave her whole life story on camera at the House Finance Committee, and then afterwards regretted it when it was broadcast on TV, and she was back watching and just wish she hadn't said as much about the dark sides of her life. So again, I put that in there. I should underline it. Be mindful of how much you're comfortable with sharing publicly, because these meetings are generally recorded, and your record becomes permanent. So next one. So here's Rachel's story. From time to time, I always got into trouble. In elementary school, I got into trouble for not raising my hand. In middle school, I had problems understanding the assignments, so I moved around a lot, and I was told to stop fidgeting. In high school, my teacher said I was too disruptive and sent me out of the room. I went back and forth from happy to depressed. My parents were drinking a lot, so I did it too, and found it helped me feel better about myself. I started couch surfing and moved into an apartment with some friends who were not a good influence because of drinking and partying. And when I was staying there, I got arrested and had to go to treatment as part of my sentence. They sent me to out-of-state residential psychiatric treatment away from my family. When I came back to Alaska, my caseworker made me go to a therapist, and that has helped me see why things are the way they are and how I can be in control better. She's nice to me and acts like she cares. She helps me see that maybe I'm an okay person and that I have a lot of positive skills, like I'm a good people person, I can multitask, and I'm a good artist. Okay, so that's the telling the story part. Short and sweet. That was probably under a minute, minute and a half. So let's go to Justin's story. And I'm talking really fast because I see I only have 10 minutes left and I want to get through this. So Justin's story. The Anchorage Street Clinic provides counseling and support for people with substance use disorders. The majority of our clients are homeless with a primary diagnosis of chronic alcoholism and do not have the resources to pay for our services. Our case manager is able to help clients access housing and employment services, residential treatment, and reentry support after incarceration, which are key for helping people get back on their feet and off the streets. She is very busy because the need is so great, but we are seeing lots of successes once people get a place to live, get a job, and start on the road to their recovery. We are able to bill Medicaid for most of the services, but not all. So we depend on the state's behavioral health treatment and recovery grants to supplement this gap. These grants help us keep our doors open and pay our staff. Without behavioral health grants, we would not be able to help Anchorage's most vulnerable citizens, and we would see them continue to cycle in and out of expensive hospital emergency rooms, residential treatment, and or jail, most of which the state will pay for anyway. Okay, so two very distinct stories. Let's go to the next slide. Two very distinct stories, and one's from a provider, one's from a person with lived experience, and so you can kind of see how you might be able to do this both ways. So the last point is make your ask, and this is probably the most important part of the whole experience of telling your story to a policymaker. If you don't give them something to work on, they're not the expert, and they're not going to know what the answer is. You have to give them the answer. You have to give them the solution that you want them to work on. It's just too big of a mountain to imagine if you're a business, a policymaker who's a business person who has no idea about social services, and then you come in and dump the problem on them and then say, fix it. It doesn't fly so well. It flies a whole lot better if you say, here's the problem and here's how to fix it. And then they've got something to work on, and something they can get excited about. So you always need to have an ask. That's always my advice. And when you talk about your ask, you want to tell what you want the policymaker to do. For example, please support community support services, or please support behavioral health treatment. Just, one-liner. And going back to what Mike was saying, if you don't want to be perceived of as lobbying, you can keep the ask very general. support community support services. That's a general ask. That's not lobbying. But when you ask specifically, please support SB 121, vote for SB 121. That is a specific ask for a specific piece of legislation. And I just advise, if you're working for a nonprofit and there's any question about what you can ask for, what you can't ask for, keep it general. And it's the same for state workers. Well, let's not talk about state workers, because no state workers is allowed to advocate on their own time. On their personal time, yes, but not on their own time. So anyway, having an ask, I prefer keeping it general and broad to educate the legislator and not ask for specific legislation unless you can do so. So address the public good. I think if you tell the legislator what the action or ask will, how it will benefit other people, their family members or community, you can kind of get you can get their empathy a little bit better. And then this last sentence just reiterates what I said earlier. State workers and some nonprofit employees are restricted from making asks for specific legislation. If you're representing an organization, be sure to ask your supervisor about what you can and cannot ask for. And people representing themselves can ask for what they want, but it has to be on their own time. So let's go to the next slide. So here's Rachel's ask. I hope that you will support funding for mental health services like treatment and therapy that give young people with mental illness support as they transition into adulthood, so we can stay stable, out of trouble, and out of expensive residential care. Thank you for taking the time to hear my story. And here's Justin's ask. Please support behavioral health treatment and recovery grants in the state's budget so that the Anchorage Clinic can continue to serve Alaska's most vulnerable citizens and keep Anchorage's streets healthier and safer. Thank you for your support. Now that's a very specific ask, and that item is in the budget. So that would be considered, on the lobbying side. So just keep that in mind when you look at those two asks. So let's go to the next slide. One of the most important things I really try to instill in people who are new to this is that your experience, you're the expert of your experience. You don't need a chart, you don't need a report, you don't need research to prove who you are and what has happened to you and how you feel and what your opinion is. These are all things that you are the expert of, and no one can argue with that, and really have confidence in that. When you walk in to tell your story, there's no argument. There's no argument. You can't argue with your story because it's your story and you're the expert. So, I mean, they might disagree with your choices and argue with you with that, but they can't say, no, that's not true. You just have confidence in your own personal story. But again, reiterating to be aware of your limits and how much you're comfortable sharing publicly. Public meetings are recorded and your comments will be a permanent record. So, you may not want to tell all. That's my point. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so tips for public testimony. This slide presentation is longer than we'll have time for. I figured that I added the things that I would try to squeeze in if possible. Did you want me to stop now and take questions? I'm not looking at the chat at all. So are there questions for me? Should I do that with my last 4 minutes? Or should I go through public testimony, which is only like 3 or 4?
I think you're fine. I don't see any questions coming through the chat. And also Tom is scheduled to come on at 3:40. So we do have a little bit of time, especially if there's no questions that arise.
Oh, I thought I was supposed to be over at 3:30. Well, that's a gift. Thank you.
Surprise.
Right. Okay. Oh, good. Well, I should have slowed down a lot sooner than this. All right. Okay. So tips for public testimony. It's basically the same structure as having a meeting with the legislator, but there's a few other little nuances that I want to go over. So again, public testimony is inviting members of the public to give their opinion on matters that affect them. So it's, it usually happens in public places, public, you know, like the Anchorage Assembly or the City Council Assembly Chambers, or in the legislature, the state capitol, it happens in committee rooms all throughout the legislature. So there's these public places you can go to offer public testimony. So let's go to the next slide. So one of the things you have to do ahead of time is sign up. And there's usually a list. If you're in person, you would do that on a piece of paper when you walk in the room. It's usually sitting right off to the side. And you know, you just put your name, and they take people in order that you signed in. So if you want to go on early, get there in advance. If the public testimony starts at 6, get in there at 5:30 and get your name on the list. If you're doing it remotely, which is how I think it's going to be this legislative session, all public testimony is likely going to be over the phone, then what you do is with the legislature, there's an 800 number that you can call, and you get on and you give the person your name. They put you on the list, and then they basically put you on hold with the ability to listen to the committee. So basically you're just kind of in this holding pattern, waiting and listening for your name to be called. But at some point your name will be called, and then you need to be ready to go. So the first thing before you start is to know how much time you have to speak. Again, that's 2 or 3 minutes thing is a general rule. Sometimes it's 5 minutes, but generally it's 2 or 3 minutes. So absolutely stick to that time limit. I hear people going over all the time, and it's sort of like this disregard. No, what I'm saying is really important, and I'm just going to keep going. And the policymaker is trying to stop them, trying to cut them off, and they just keep going. And what that ends up doing is it serves to irritate committee members, and it turns them against your cause. I mean, not every time, but it can very likely turn them against your cause. And that is counterproductive to what you want. And I've seen it happen a million times. Legislators are human. And if people irritate them, it's, you know, it takes a big person to rise above that, especially after hours and hours of listening to public testimony, which happens. Like, so there's some days where they're in the room for 6 hours, 7 hours, 8 hours listening to public testimony, one right after another. And that one person who comes on and goes on and on and on and berates the policymakers, I mean, trust me, they're not winning any votes for their issue, whatever the issue is. So keep in mind, keep to the time limit, but also don't irritate the don't berate the policymakers. And we'll talk about that in a second. So let's go to the next slide. Present your opinion in a respectful manner. Again, just like I said, it's really hard not to get irritated, because if you're a person who's experiencing stigma or resources that have been cut down so badly that you don't have anymore, you don't have access to services, access to things, then you might you end up finding that you can be irritated yourself, and you can communicate that irritation, and people get accusatory to policymakers. And while granted they make the laws and they are responsible for a lot of the budget decisions that happen, it just doesn't help your case if you unload on them. So as hard as it is not to get irritated yourself, I really recommend not doing it. Really try to keep yourself calm and try to be respectful. Because then if you treat them with respect, you will be treated with respect in return. And let's go to the next one. Okay, so I guess that was everything that I had. Again, with having public testimony, you want to do the exact same thing. You want to tell your story. Sorry, you want to introduce yourself, and you want to tell where you live and tell what your topic is. You want to tell your story, including challenges and successes, and you want to have and the solutions. And then you want to have your ask at the end. Same exact thing. So just what we went through before, talking about telling your story, use that same strategy, that same structure for public testimony. I'm telling you, it's almost like you can't go wrong with a personal story. I've seen legislators cry in public testimony when the Governor's Council of Disability Special Education and the KEY campaign, they still come to Juneau, but back when I was a legislative aide, they would come and they would have family member after family member come up with their children in wheelchairs or their children with autism or with cerebral palsy or whatever the disability is, sitting with them, giving their heartfelt story. And every time the legislators, you would see tears, you would see, okay, what do you want me to do? Just, it's like, it melts people's hearts. And policymakers are people too. They have hearts too. And they respond to heartfelt stories. So really just use it. And I don't mean in a manipulative sense, but take what's yours and use it as a tool to get what you want, basically. So, all right, since we do, if there are any questions at this point before I go on to this next section, which is the last section? Nope. Okay, just you'll let me know, Chris, but you'll have to let me know. I'm not looking at the chat, so you'll just have to like pop in. Okay, so when you go to meet with a policymaker in their office, and again, we're probably not going to be doing this for a while, but these in-person meetings, but whether it's on the phone or whether it's in person, you want to be on time for your appointment. Again, policymakers are like back-to-back meetings, especially during legislative session, just boom, boom, boom. Everything is like every 15 minutes, change to this, change to that. It's so hyper, it's a hyper situation. And so you can't just saunter in, you have to really be on time. So if you're not going to be on time, let them know, call ahead of time. Otherwise you may lose your chance to ever meet with them again. Don't be disappointed if you meet with staff. Staff are the gateway to the policymaker. As a staff member, my boss couldn't always meet with everybody who came in the office. And often me and my coworkers, we would meet with people. But I'll tell you one time, and Anna Sappa is on this call, and Anna Sappa came into my office when I was working for Max Gruenberg, and she sat down and told us her story in exactly this same format that we're talking about today. And she got me excited about this whole idea. I had no idea what her world and the world of recovery was like, and treatment. This was a time when before I knew anything that I know now. And she opened my eyes to it through her personal story. And then I got excited about it. My boss just left the meeting and went off to his meeting, to his next meeting. But I kept in touch with Anna, and I started to get in touch with other people. And by the end of the session, I was giving my boss speeches on substance abuse treatment that he never would have wanted, or he did it, and he was open to it and he did it. But it was my idea, and I pushed it on him, and so I'm saying staff, if you can get a staff member excited about one of your issues or your issue, you can really, move the idea along up to the legislator. They're the gatekeepers, the staff are. And so it's not a bad thing to meet it's not a bad thing to meet with a staffer. So don't be disappointed if that's what happens, really. So again, give your introduction, tell your story, make your ask, be friendly, not confrontational. If the policy maker disagrees with your position, agree to disagree and just move on. I mean, it's not worth everybody has their own personal things. Some people like to fight, so I'm not going to say don't fight, but I'm just saying there's consequences if you get into an argument and you irritate them. It's okay to say, I don't know. Especially if you're going in there just as a citizen, you can say, I don't know the answer to that, but you can write down the question and get back to them later. And you can that's a standard line that everybody uses up at the Capitol is, I'm sorry, Senator so-and-so, I don't know the answer to that, but I'll get back with you. I'll give you the answer later. That's just a standard line everybody memorizes to throw when they don't know something. And then the last thing I recommend is leave a folder with backup information, because the legislator may not always remember everything you said, but if you write your testimony down and put it like as a letter or just whatever, but written in a folder with any kind of research that you might have, or, you know, your business card, whatever, you know, just whatever you're not going to be able to squeeze into the meeting. If you throw it into a folder, then they can have that to rely on, you know, additional information. So most people who come to visit legislative offices come with a folder of information. So you can even put letters of support in there from other organizations or other people's stories who've given you permission to, you can give them a stack of personal stories if you're really trying to make a point. So folder with backup information is a valuable thing. And let's go to the next slide. Oh, thank you. That's it. We're at the end. Okay, so again, I want to thank for the opportunity. Thanks, Tiffany. She came to the training a few years ago. A few other people I recognize have been to this training. And we are doing some trainings coming up this fall. Just jot down my phone number, my email, if you have a question. It's right there, because we're going to switch slides. So just give it a couple more minutes, or like another minute, Chris, and then can you get that joint advocacy page called up from the Mental Health Trust? I want to show everybody that page too. So to get in touch with me, this is my contact. But then I also want to encourage everybody, if you're interested in the longer version of this training, this advocacy thing that I just offered today, we're going to be doing 4 different trainings. It's the same identical training, but done 4 different times this fall. And we have them, I forget the dates, I haven't memorized them. I think, oh, I wish there was someone who knew. But let's go to the joint advocacy page, because I think that's up there. Do you have that ready? Okay, so if you scroll down, so if you want, I see the question, if you want to get on the joint advocacy list, they're on the, so you go to alaskamentalhealthtrust.org. So the URL again is Alaska Mental Health Trust, all one word, .org/joint advocacy. And what that is it's the joint advocacy is the Mental Health Trust, the Advisory Board on Alcoholism and Drug Abuse, Mental Health Board, Aging, Commission on Aging, and Governor's Council, Disabilities and Special Education. We all have this joint advocacy. We formed a coalition to do joint advocacy efforts. So this is our page. And if you, could you just go to go to the training flyer just for the second. Click on the yellow, the red, it says, no, the red, click, no, go back, let's go back to that page, click out of that page, and you can see the red, click here to view the 2020 flyer, there you go. Okay, so there's the flyer describing the training, the full day training. There's one on Friday, October 23rd. The same one will be offered again on Thursday, November 5th. And another opportunity is Saturday, November 14th. And the last opportunity would be Wednesday, November 18th. It's a full day training, 9 to 3:30. We will take a long lunch break, but trust me, there's lots of engaging activities, and we'll do some breakouts and practice. And it's not going to be a long sit in your chair boring day, I don't think. So that's happening. The other, if you go back, there used to be how to join our action network on that page, and I'm not seeing it. Could you?
Hey, Teri?
Yes.
This is Tiffany. I will take a look to see if I can find how to sign up for it. But in the meantime, we have a question from Natasha.
Okay. Okay, yeah, but just, you have to go to the URL that just says Alaska mentalhealthtrust.org/joint advocacy. That's all, because I think we've gone one page further, and we want to get back, because that's where you can join the network, but I'm not positive. Anyway, what's your question, Natasha?
Hi, thank you for taking a question. So I've done quite a bit of advocacy in my time, and so I might have missed it today, or maybe it's in a different training, but I heard you say over and over again that, you know, policymakers care. I don't know that I necessarily agree with that statement, especially with the advocacy I've done. So how do you problem solve? I'll give you a good example. I went to lobby our legislators on behalf of the Head Start Association a few years ago. And I met with a senator who will remain nameless. And when I met with this person, I said, hey, I'm here on behalf of Head Start. I shared my story, did everything you said. I actually went with the executive director of the Head Start. I was very familiar with the program, had 3 years of experience being on their policy council. And so we didn't go there to ask for more money. We just said, hey, we know things are tight. Please don't take any money away. And the response from the senator was, well, you know, we owe over $1 billion to China. And I was like, well, the state of Alaska owes over $1 billion to China. Like, no, the US. And I was like, well, what does that have to do with the Alaskan budget? You know, and so that's kind of some of the hurdles that I've come across. And so how do you navigate those where you just run across someone, usually it runs along party lines, where people are particularly apathetic about whatever it is that you're there for? Can you speak about that?
Sure. I'm a big fan of that book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. That book, or books like it, or strategies like it, basically give you kind of some tools for how to work with difficult people. So if you encounter a difficult person, or a person that's not listening to you, or that is acting apathetic or even rude to you, then you know, I believe it's like psychology 101 kind of stuff, that you find a way to talk to them that you know, that serves to win them over. I mean, we all have our own styles, and you know, I know my style is I piss a lot of people off, you know, so I know how that goes, and that's how it works for me. So I've really had to work on my own delivery and my own ability to kind of work around people who are difficult, and it's not an easy thing to do, and maybe it's even impossible for some, especially on certain topics. I mean, if you walk in, Head Start doesn't sound like too much of a controversial topic, but who knows? You know, I know there was one legislator who her husband had an alcohol problem, and he had been to treatment, you know, 6 times and failed every time. And so she had no faith in treatment, and she thought all treatment was bad, and she was along with the governor, who had the similar attitude, because he had a relative who had an alcohol problem, who had abused the family trust. The two of them got together and basically took all treatment out of the Department of Corrections. And I mean, there was no getting around, there was no changing their minds. They had an attitude about treatment, and they were successful in getting rid of it. So, I mean, I think a lot of it is sometimes you're just not going to get past that. But then I do believe that there are some tools that you can use to try to win them over, but that would be my best answer.
Thank you, Teri. I do have to stop you right there. I know we're about 5 minutes over when Tom is supposed to speak next, but
I'm so sorry.
But I do have on the screen right now what I believe is how to sign up to be a part of the Joint Advocacy Action Alert Network, and I'll be sure to throw that in the email as well, sent out to everyone who attended this call today. So thank you, Teri, for your time.
I'm so sorry for going over. Here I had all this extra time going over. So bad.
No, you're perfectly fine.
Okay, thank you.
But yeah, but with that, I am going to go back to our agenda and introduce Tom Lucas, Campaign Disclosure Coordinator with APOC, and he will talk about the fine line between education and campaigning, when to register, and reporting requirements with APOC. And with that, I hand it to Tom.
Good afternoon. I take it you can all hear me?
Yep.
Thank you. Well, I am here to discuss when an organization's educational efforts may cross over into campaigning. I'm probably going to disappoint most of you to the extent that there is no black and white line that, that you can look at. Rather, there is language in the statutes that must be interpreted depending on the facts of the particular situation. But basically what we're looking at is whether or not a communication made by an organization, when read as a whole and with limited reference to outside events, is susceptible of no other reasonable interpretation but as an exhortation to vote one way or the other on an issue, whether it's a ballot proposition or if it is support or opposition to a particular candidate. So that is the basic issue that we're looking at. So in each case, it depends on exactly what it is you're saying and what is going on in the political world at the time. I will give a couple of examples. One of the lead cases that we've had is called I'm sorry, I'm scrolling. The Renewable Resources Coalition. And that case came out in 2008. In that case, the Renewable Resources Coalition had for several years opposed the Pebble Mine. And they used phrases in their advocacy, such as protecting clean water. During the period of their advocacy, however, there were two Alaska Clean Water initiatives that came up. So the question that was asked was whether or not they could continue their educational efforts and even continue using the phrase clean water without their activities being considered expenditures that would require reporting and registration. In looking at the case, what was important, well, there were several things that were important, but the most important was how long have they been doing this? In this case, they had been doing this for years, using the same types of phraseology and the same types of advertisements. Under those, in that situation, where they did not actually say, vote this way or vote that way, and there was nothing in their communications that could lead someone to say, this sure looks like an exhortation to vote one way or the other without actually saying those words. In that case, the commission found that there was no reporting or registration requirement. And one of the things that they looked at, in addition to the fact that they had been doing this for years, is the context in which it happened. In a later case, the commission warned that changes in the number of activities, the usual location of activities, or the content of the activities, taken in context of in the context of a ballot proposition, could trigger a reporting requirement. An example might be that whereas in the renewable resources cases, the coalition had done their advertisements in a certain way, using certain phrases, if suddenly when an initiative proposition came up, they're suddenly doing 3 times as many advertisements, and they have changed the advertisement slightly so that it tilts perhaps even slightly towards an exhortation to vote one way or the other, the commission would take a look at it. So it looks at how long has this been going on, and what is the context in which it's doing, in which you're doing the communications, and has there been any substantial change in what is in the communications, how often you communicate, and how you communicate. If suddenly you're communicating on television 4 times a day where you've never done it before, that could be something that would be looked at. And that's why I say I'm probably not going to be giving you an answer that you're going to be happy with, because in fact, the devil is in the details. Each case has to be looked at on its own merits. But the basic issue is whether or not, all things being considered, this could be looked at as an exhortation to vote one way or the other, either for a ballot proposition or for a candidate. As to the ramifications of having to register and report, if you are an organization whose primary purpose is something other than influencing the results of an election, then you are what we call an entity. So you would be required to register as an entity. That's a real easy document to fill out. It's done electronically through the My Alaska portal. It would probably take about 10-15 minutes. You would need to know your officers and directors. And that's about it. Registration is simple. The second thing is independent expenditure reports. That's a little more difficult, but that is a report that is triggered by making an expenditure for a communication that could be considered to be an exhortation to vote one way or the other. That report is must be filed within 10 days of making the expenditure. Here it could get a little tricky because in APOC land, an expenditure is made when a debt is incurred. The example I like to give is that you go to the printer, you say, I want 50 copies of this flyer. What's it going to cost me? The printer says about $100. You say, okay, let's do it. You have just triggered an expenditure. You now have a debt that must be reported within 10 days. Now, oftentimes people will say, but we don't know how much it is. And then what I will say is, when you put in the debt, there's a box you can fill in that is a description. And in that description, you can indicate that this is an estimate. And by giving that estimate of what you actually know at that point, you will have met the requirements of your independent expenditure report. The penalties for failure to file and register can be substantial. The maximum civil penalty for a failure to timely register is $50 per day for each day that the violation continues. And it is the same for an independent expenditure report. We have had cases where a complaint was not filed by somebody from the public for months after somebody should have registered. And there have been substantial maximum civil penalties in the nature of $5,000, $10,000. So the penalties can get big because it's $50 per day. So it is something to be concerned with. To take a close look at your communications and what you're planning on doing and saying, and try to determine the extent to which it is tilting over towards what we would call election advocacy, as opposed to pure education. Not to scare you with the numbers on the penalty assessments, because in fact those assessments can be mitigated. If an example might be if you're brand new to the system, you've never had to file or register before, there's an automatic 50% reduction. And there are other reductions based on how much harm was done to the public. At this point, I've probably confused you enough. You may have some questions, and if you do, I'd be happy to take them. And if you don't, I will take my leave.
I have a question.
It looks like, yeah, Anna.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I'll just ask it verbally. So earlier, Mike Walsh had provided information about, well, the IRS implications, but also the state implications. And he talked a little bit about engaging on draft regulations or things that the executive branch does versus a campaign. So I was just hoping you could provide some clarity about that. Like, for example, submitting a public comment or, you know, meeting with, you know, department officials about a regulation. Thanks.
You are bringing lobbying into the game. And actually, I am the campaign disclosure coordinator, and I really don't do lobbying. However, I can tell you that attempting to influence an administrative officer can be considered lobbying. And that a general rule is that as long as you do not do more than 10 hours in any 30 year, you do not have to register as a lobbyist. But if you do have further lobbying questions, I'm going to admit my almost complete ignorance in this area. If you do have further lobbyist questions, the person to talk to is Heather Dahlberg in our Juneau office.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, it looks like that was the only question, unless somebody else that has not posted on the chat does have a question. Okay, I guess we can proceed from there. Tom, thank you so much for your time.
You are welcome. Thank you for the opportunity to present here.
Great. So I just want to wrap up and thank you all for attending our inaugural advocacy training seminar. You can connect with us at Recover Alaska through any of these social media platforms and also through our website at recoveralaska.org. We actually just updated our events page where users can actually submit a request to put their event onto our page. And with this, we tend to share these events on our social media profiles quite regularly. So we definitely encourage you all to engage in our events calendar. And that will be it right there. And if you all have any questions, I know we're almost exactly at 4 p.m. So I just want to open the floor with any questions. Also a reminder that I will be emailing you all who have attended this Zoom session with all the resources that we've discussed so far, and also a recording of the session as well. But with that, I open the floor for any questions, and thank you all for attending.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.